So this is intended to be notes towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, the continuation of the first section of what I imagine and assume, will become a lengthy investigation of the Metapoetics of Paranarratology. And the subtitle of the first segment of Notes Towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology, as my audience is well familiar at this point, is a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. This is and this segment of that 17-part elaboration and/or part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling is this is part 9, and part 9 is titled "The Grand Piano as Discursive Domain of Rhetorical Deception." And my mouth is not particularly responsive today. It's a little after 5 a.m. and perhaps not all of the organs and components of my body and my mind are equally awake, and my mouth in particular doesn't seem to be entirely conscious, and I can feel that as I try to utter these words that my mouth is still waking up. So as a kind of disclaimer to the beginning of this piece, and if there are an excessive number of parapraxes in this particular discursive narration that I'm performing this morning, they're probably a result of some kind of lag that the motor domain of the virtuosity of my mouth and all of its various organs, the tongue and the lips and all that's going on here is having problems communicating effectively with with its cognitive base camp or ground control. We could say that like that David Bowie song, "Ground Control to Major Tom." The mind here, or the brain, is ground control, and the organ of the mouth and the speaking is Major Tom, and the mind wants to assure Major Tom that everything's all right, and that his excursion into space is well supported by those at home, and they're observing his movements and actions, and the performance of his various responsibilities as an astronaut, and that there's nothing to worry about, but there's a moment in which the connection, the signal between the two is comes into question, and I believe that the technological apparatus that provides the means of traveling into space is referred to in that song as a tin can, and here I am floating in my tin can, and tin can isn't perhaps the image that one would want to constitute this vehicle in which one is suspended and upon which one's life depends. But fortunately, my life doesn't depend upon this particular discussion. But anyway, that's that's the the provisional apology, or disclaimer at the outset that I needed to perform today, and then also that very unfortunately as well, I seem to have given whatever the virus that I have is to Lori, and so Lori may be coughing in the background as well, and so there'll be a certain amount of perhaps miscommunication between ground control and Major Tom. That will be, running interference in the production of this particular segment of the talk, as well as the usual background noise that includes the dogs and other sounds in the small apartment here in Fort Defiance, and then perhaps also an increase in the noise level that results from the fact that as I said, unfortunately, have given my cold and all of the attendant symptoms of the virus to Lori, and so that may increase the noise and one could say that may increase the noise as arche, lurking in the background, and I can hear just now the heater has kicked in, and all of these elements of background. David Antin does attend to the construct of noise in this piece, but he plays it out rhetorically as a simple binary, between the signal is good and noise is bad, and he does so in reference to the production of commercial collages that he critiques as examples of interrupting the productivity of narrative in the experience of television, and watching television and the narratives of 1950 television and being interrupted and sold these multiply nefarious commercial products, right, that all depended upon these curious and in some ways monstrous, right, chimerical collage structures and strategies. And but there's another way of thinking of the noise that belongs to any signal, and that way brings it closer perhaps to the interests of someone like John Cage, whose muse, particularly, well, he has perhaps dependent upon more than one set of muse, but who's profoundly, right, whose work profoundly bears upon the muse that we've discussed in this piece, arche. And arche is in this sense the representation of all those material elements that belong to the physical universe, and their ontological status, and those elements of arche aren't merely objects in space and time, but include space and time themselves, right? Duration and onset and conclusion. So when Cage creates a piece such as 4 minutes and 33 seconds, or I believe that we questioned whether that was the accurate time frame and the duration in which this segment occurs, and I believe that we argued that it doesn't in some way matter whether it's 3 minutes and 44 seconds or 4 minutes and 33 seconds, although we didn't do the research that we promised that we would do and find out if there was a symbolic value for that length of time. But it's a length of time in which a certain amount of attention can be engaged in a serious and significant way, even if one isn't trained in the act of meditation. Now, I'm going to step out of what David is doing here and my take on what David is doing here, and to note that when I lived in in Astoria, in Queens, in New York, right? Astoria, Queens, New York. Three concentric circles of understanding the universe. That perhaps also belong to this idea of arche. And you'll recall that this is a reference to the way that Stephen Dedalus organizes the conditions of his existence in a portrait of the artist as a young man, right? So near Steinway, if we wanted to even to specify near the intersection of Steinway and 30th Street, right? I was on 31st, but 30th is a more significant street, and I was between actually I was between 30th, which is significant, and Broadway, which is also significant. Obviously Broadway is significant, right? So Broadway and Steinway is a major intersection in Astoria, Queens, New York, New York, the United States. If we wanted to complete the Stephen Dedalus elaboration of concentric circles that belong to arche, but and we'll get to the grand pianos that are created on Steinway, because they bear upon this discussion in an interesting way, and they're there in our title for part 9. The grand piano as a discursive domain of rhetorical deception, which is different, than the way that the grand piano is perhaps used in a piece like 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Because in 4 minutes and 33 seconds, the grand piano is used as a framing device, that in which the formal dimension and the seriousness that perhaps belongs to the muse melite, to thought, meditation, practice, and occasion. The seriousness of the thought, the seriousness of the occasion, the seriousness of the practice, the seriousness of the meditation is given and granted a certain weight and symbolic significance, by the presence, perhaps, if it's there, of a grand piano. And how would you know that you were listening to music unless you had, such a sign, such an index in a certain sense, that becomes symbolic, by virtue of what we associate with the grand piano. And, but metonymically, right, that grand piano opens up, the potentiality of a lot of narrative memory as well, and a lot of associative memory. If one ever spent time, on Steinway, whether one lived there or not, or just remembered, that this is where these grand pianos are made, a certain kind of difference than if one is just looking at a grand piano and perhaps seeing in it the reference to Orpheus's lyre, the way that the shape of the harp, right, is represented in the piano, and understanding that it's a relationship to perhaps a particular instrument played by a particular performer, under the aegis of a particular muse, right? And one is seeing the reference, or perhaps if one is seeing in the piano and remembering early cinema, and that wonderful moment in which Harpo Marx takes apart and deconstructs the grand piano, or perhaps one remembers other moments in early cinema in which a grand piano is brought into an apartment building or some small room, and exactly what the technical apparatus is, the physics involved in lifting a grand piano, and perhaps raising it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or however many stories, and that problem, if one remembers such a scene from such a cinema, brings to the grand piano a lot of other associative possibilities that possibilities that may or may not belong to intersections of memory and cinema and other materialities of lived experience, right? And in a certain way, those characteristics bring together the muse arche, because these are collage-like, right? Collage-like materials, but they're being organized by memory. That original muse who took control and claimed that right, all of the muses, were her daughters, and when in fact, if you recall, that that only Cleo, right, and Calliope were initially the daughters were the daughters of memory, the only actual daughters of memory, right? Although, one could claim that she had other daughters if one metaphorized and included her granddaughters, the daughters of Calliope and Cleo. And we've discussed all that. And David said, and we're moving toward, I want to honor Jerry Rothenberg, he says, my good friend Jerry Rothenberg, and I want to honor him by discussing Coyote as a muse and the way that Coyote, might bear upon this idea of rhetorical deception as discursive domain, because Coyote, certainly has extraordinarily, and he lifts his arms up to signify the expansive relationship that Coyote has with the domain of rhetorical deception, right? And Coyote certainly has an important, role in the constitution of this domain of rhetorical deception, and we need to get to that. He says, but we probably won't get to that in this section. It's a really lengthy piece, and you can see that, even to perform this piece, he requires this incredible, stamina and physical endurance, right? To stand here for the hours, how many hours this 17-part, presentation and reading, actually took. I haven't counted the hours, but we should do that, at some point. And he just continues on, and it's really a dynamically, powerful performance of endurance, and in that sense, it relates to. And this is me again, stepping out of what David does. He doesn't really talk about that here, but it relates to other, types of performance art that require these aspects of endurance, right? Like shaking the hand of every sanitation worker in the city of New York, or spending a year in a without going indoors, or spending another year. Confined, to a jail cell, or spending a decade, playing out the expressions, right, and the expressions and mental states of madness, and also being subject to the social conditions and institutionalizations and explorations of control that playing out these expressions of madness actually produce, right, as a social response. That kind of endurance strategy is certainly enlisted, or riding the subway for a day and writing down all of the details of what one perceives, visually, acoustically, in terms of all of the other senses, or if not the subway and all of that, perhaps if one were living in the Bay Area, say BART, or something like that, or one could go to Disneyland, right, and ride the monorail all day, and one would have a similar experience, but it would be defined and contextualized in a way that was slightly comic, and that brings us back to, says David, that brings us back to that this figure, this muse that's often neglected in classical studies, but certainly as a part of Native American culture, and that I want to honor Jerry Rothenberg, my good friend Jerry Rothenberg, by talking about. And this figure, of course, is coyote, and one would think, David says that that coyote would be one of the sons or daughters of either Dolus or Eris, or I guess if you were following Hyginus, maybe Ether or Gaia, but they would belong. You would think that the figure, the muse coyote, you would imagine, perhaps, belongs to the pseudologoi, but he says, but you would be making a mistake there, because coyote is in fact, he's part of this generation that proceeds from the thaumaturgioi, right? The thaumaturgioi, and because coyote was one of these figures that could really make things happen. And he says, and when we talked about the thaumaturgioi, David says, you recall that I mentioned there was a positive aspect. These guys could make it rain, or these women could make it rain, and they could traverse the ontological boundaries between this world and the underworld, and they could perform all of these, fantastical border crossings between the fictive and the real, and this made them quite valuable. But you also recall that there was a negative aspect, and that was and referred to, if there was someone you didn't like, and you noticed that they were walking down a set of stairs, and you could these artists, who resided under the force and power of these muses of thaumaturgia, could cause someone that perhaps they didn't like to slip and fall down that set of stairs. So this is the true, right, origin. This is the true archaeological origin of this figure of coyote, and we'll get to coyote, but what I want to do today, he says, and then so he introduces the notion of coyote, but he says, but what I want to do today is I want to discuss this grand piano that Michael Mersel talked about at the outset of my performance, and that seemed to be a kind of a side, or it seemed to be have merely a paranarratological relationship to the performance that I'm producing in relationship to these ideas of rhetorical deception, the varieties of rhetorical deception in narrative and non-narrative storytelling, and he says, but in fact, it relates more closely and clearly than it may have appeared to relate to, and in that sense, relates to the notion of a metapoetics of rhetorical deception, and specifically, since we've already introduced the idea of discursive domain, and the way that a rhetorical deception can create a discursive domain, now we can return to Michael Mersel's discussion of the grand piano, and his claim, that this grand piano is being moved following my discussion into this room as a change of scenery, and we'll open this up as a discursive domain, David Antin says, and see where that leads us in relationship to these ideas of both collage, and the external narratives that frame, autobiography, whether that autobiography is conceived of as a life narrative or whether it's conceived of as a life narrative, that engages rhetorical deception and strategies of rhetorical deception as an opening for this idea of discursive domain. And then David Antin goes back and says, well, in case that's getting too complicated to follow, let's just go back and trace what we did with that. You'll recall that we talked about Kathy Acker on the road to Thebes, and she encounters this guy in her narrative experience and her narrative tellings, and claims that Herbert Marcuse was her teacher, when in fact that seems to be a form of rhetorical deception. And we said, well, what does this mean? Why Herbert Marcuse on the road to Thebes, and why is that Kathy Acker, playing the role of Oedipus? And he says, well, if you play it out a little bit, you can imagine Herbert Marcuse there on the road, and he's Laius, and he's, he steps out of his chariot, and he says, where are you going? And she says, I'm going to Thebes. And he says, well, Thebes, the road to Thebes is closed. You get that, right? And she says, why? And why are you telling me I can't go to Thebes? He says, well, here I'm playing the part of your father. You're Oedipus, and I'm Laius, and I'm here to kill you, because in my version of the story of Oedipus, which comes from Aristophanes and not Sophocles, right? That I've been informed that you're on the way, and that you're bound to murder me, and I'm here to stop you from doing that by jumping the gun on you, and and she says, well, why do you want to kill me? And it's just like, I didn't even realize that I was on a course, to dispatch you, Mr. Marcuse. She's very polite in this moment, and she says, I didn't even realize that the course of, I realized, that I was on the road to Thebes, but I thought it had something to do with transgression. And he says, yeah, it has everything to do with transgression, and that's why I have to stop you. Have you, you're familiar with this notion of repressive desublimation, right? And she says, yeah, of course, and he says, well, he says, well, transgression is no longer possible, right? So transgression is no longer possible, and your journey to Thebes, is being engaged, right, under the sign of transgression, and I'm here as a symbolic representation of repressive sublimation to tell you that you're never going to get there, because things have changed. And she says, well, Mr. Marcuse, I've been working out, and I'm I'm perhaps more capable of. I'm strong, and I'm youthful, and as I said, I've been working out. You can see my muscles here, and I'm more than capable of handling myself. Just like David Antin is. She says in that story, where he talks about illusion, and this woman, this red-haired woman named Mary, that he's, and it could be any number of Marys, but it's this particular Mary that he's going out with at the time, warns him that, she has this ex-husband, and, he's jealous, and he may come after her. And David says, well, I can take care of myself, because I'm kind of one of these Greek heroes. And just like that, just like David can take care of himself, Kathy says to Herbert Marcuse, I can too. So don't threaten me with your repressive desublimation, symbolic or otherwise. And then she says, and beyond all of that, I'm not Oedipus. She says, Herbert Marcuse, just to let you know, I'm not Oedipus. I'm the Sphinx. And that's a kind of twist, in the plot right there, right? That's that's the peripeteia right there, the classic reversal. And he's like, what? You're not? I'm here to kill Oedipus. And she's like, no, I'm not Oedipus. I'm the Sphinx. And then it becomes like a game of rock, paper, scissors, right? Because if if Laius is trying to kill Oedipus and Oedipus is trying to kill Laius, and then you have the Sphinx, and who knows what happens in that story, because it depends on, you know, whether you're taking Sophocles seriously or whether you look back at the Aristophanes and you say, like, oh yeah, she really fooled the guy. She fooled the guy, because, you know, Oedipus, who's the the Bomolo, the Bomolo, how do you say, Bomolocus. Oedipus is the Bomolocus, right? In Aristophanes, and he's been working out too, or maybe not working out, but he's had to defend himself because, you know, he's he's the scapegoat, right, for all of these children in ancient Greece, you know, who are very, you know, proud of their your physical prowess, and he's a clubfoot, right? He's disabled, and so he has to take all of this abuse, just like disabled people always take all of this abuse. And and maybe, you know, he has a speech impediment or something, or in addition, you know, to being club-footed, that's not mentioned. And anyway, you know, part of his, you know, being this strong guy who can take care of himself, you know, results from this mistreatment. But it also kind of makes him mean. So you have all that going on, and then you have the whole rock paper scissors things. Who can kill who, and it depends on whether you're in Sophocles or whether you're in Aristophanes. You know, Aristophanes, the smile of the Sphinx, really changes the dimensions of the story, right? And so in that story, we're not sure, but we're fairly sure that at least what Laius believes is that, you know, he has the power to kill Oedipus. And so there's a kind of peripeteia moment in which, you know, he realizes maybe he can't, and that Oedipus is a bit stronger than he imagines that he perhaps was, you know, because he was, you know, abused and teased and harassed and bullied and beaten up so many times, you know, when he was a child, and that made him tough, just like Kathy Acker's weightlifting and living on these, you know, gritty streets, you know, in a certain way, you know, made her, you know, kind of tough. And but then there's this whole you know, hidden power of the Sphinx that the Oedipus himself forgets, right? That she has wings, and when she throws herself over the cliff, because why? She's so upset that he solved her riddle, which, you know, in Aristophanes, he doesn't solve her riddle. Her throwing herself to her death is just, you know, this form of rhetorical deception. And then when she's out of, you know, Oedipus's visual range, she spreads her wings and she flies off, and she's laughing, and she's, you know, she's laughing and smiling because she got Oedipus to do exactly what she wanted him to do, right? And that's a mode of rhetorical deception. So he recounts all of that, you know, to remind us of what a discursive domain is and how it's opened by a moment of rhetorical deception. And he points out the fact that what's opened as a discursive domain in the rhetorical deception that Kathy Acker deploys in saying that Herbert Marcuse was her teacher at UCSD is that it allows her to address the problematic relationship that Herbert Marcuse's construct of repressive sublimation represents to an individual who is profoundly driven by the muse of transgression, and the muse of transgression, the Greek, right? The Greek word, you know, for the Greek name, you know, for that muse, you know, David Antin reminds us, is Parabasisia. And Parabasisia is comes, you know, is perhaps the, you know, perhaps the daughter of Thalia in a certain sense, you know, or that's one of the possible origins. And he doesn't mention, you know, who it is that ascribes that origin, but he he notes that that there was this stepping out, right, in Greek, comedy, in which the chorus would, directly address the audience. And this stepping out, he goes back and narrates once again. You'll recall that this stepping out was also related to these ontological border crossings that exist under the aegis of these muses, such as thaumaturgia, right? In which an object from the real world could enter a fictive domain, and it could grow into whatever it wanted to grow into in this domain of rhetorical deception, and be returned to the real world. And that's how the Greeks and other participants of this experience of the thaumaturgical, right? Made rain and saved the crops and ensured the various cycles of eternal return by participating with the sacred, which was always, in a certain sense, a transgression of this domain of the holy and this domain of the profane. And thaumaturgs, were required, to cross back and forth, between these borders. And this is, precisely, David reminds us what is going on in the deeper aspects and structure of that moment in Thalia, in comedy, in which the chorus, violates, one could say, or erases the distinction, between the fictive domain of the representation and what at least if you're an audience member, you imagine to be the reality of your viewing position, right, in this real world situation. And the chorus would the fictive characters, strictly speaking, would leave the stage, and the chorus would address the audience. And this moment, right, this moment that was also a kind of dance, and hence and hence had a relationship to some of the other muses as well, right? Particularly, Terpsichore, who you'll recall is one of the daughters of Thalcine, and Thalcinoe, right? Thalcinoe is the mother of the Thalcinoi, and Terpsichore dance is one of her daughters, and this moment had a relationship to that, because the Parabasisoi, would produce this direct address to the audience and dance, simultaneously, and the direct address in the movement of the dance as strophe and antistrophe, also represented the movement of consciousness as a kind of formation of dialectic, right? Thesis and antithesis. But all of this was going on, and it was this stepping out, or stepping from this domain of the fictive space created by as it's created in all fourth wall theater, that allowed this muse to emerge in this particular moment, and to inspire a whole following and genealogy of Parabasisoi, Physoi, right, the daughters of Parabasis, right, Parabasis, we had performed. We had performed for us an algorithmical representation of the proper way of pronouncing Parabasis, and I believe that it was Parabasis and not Parabasis. Parabasis, and she would say Parabasis for us, and we would, and then we could hold that in our mind, for a certain amount of time, but it would slip away because we were performing so many simultaneous activities as well. Anyway, so he goes back and he narrates all of that, and he says, since we have this understanding now of this, and I will get to Coyote, he says, I will get to Coyote, but I don't want to do that today. Today I want to turn to the grand piano and discuss the grand piano as a discursive domain of rhetorical deception. And he says, and you'll recall that in Michael Mersel's introduction to this piece, that he mentioned that a grand piano was going to be moved onto the stage, and that the stage was going to change, and you could take that change of the stage as a kind of segmentation in the performance. Maybe we're moving on to a new performance, or you could take it as a kind of peripetia in the action of the series of events that are being performed today, if you imagine those are constituted as a kind of singular whole. And he says, so let's return to that moment in Michael Mersel and reconstitute what he said about the grand piano, and then from there think about some of the ways in which that might be a form of rhetorical deception that gives rise to and opens this a new domain, right, of a new discursive domain, right, in the same way that the Herbert Marcuse and the misrepresentation of Herbert Marcuse as Kathy Acker's symbolic father and teacher opened us into a discursive domain in which we could discuss the possibilities of transgression within a post-theoretical framework that via the conceptualization of repressive desublimation effectively destroyed the possibility of transgression and defeated the muse of transgression apparently once and for all, right? And so let's do the same thing with the grand piano and the movement of the grand piano. So he says, so what we're gonna reconstitute is not Oedipus on the road to Thebes and the problem of this encounter and who's who. If you were on the road to Thebes, how would you know who you are? How would you know whether you were Laius, Kathy Acker, Herbert Marcuse, Oedipus, or the Sphinx, right? And what your role was, and why you had to defend this position. Like if you were Herbert Marcuse, how would you know who to stop? And if you were Kathy Acker, how would you know what your relationship to Herbert Marcuse was? Would you know that you were Oedipus, or would you know that you were, or would you misbelieve that you were the Sphinx, or the other way around, perhaps? So he says, well, this is a different kind of a problem than the problem involved in the physics, right, of transporting a grand piano into a space. Whether you have to lift that piano using a series of complicated pulleys and hoists from the outside of the building through a window, or whether you have to take it up a staircase. And these problems and deciding whether you have to take it up a staircase, so the grand piano becomes a problem of, what are the physics involved in moving this grand piano? And it's a very different kind of problem, he says, than the problem that we encounter as transgressors or guardians, on the road to Thebes, right? And you can see how that's a different kind of problem. And so we're going to address that today. But since we've already opened this idea of discursive domain that results, right? This discursive domain that results from the activities of a rhetorical deception, we can do that, and we can do that in a fairly sophisticated way. So he says, what I want to do to begin with is return to the rhetorical deception that's provided by Michael Mercel at the outset of his introduction to my telling, my discourse today, and then I'm stepping out of what David is saying, just momentarily, and I said, well, and I'm going to say this. Instead of what David does which is to return, right, to the recording, and he says, Michael, can you please, play this, section in which, you talked about, the movement of the grand piano, and he does, and then David, moves on and discusses what Michael Mercel does as a domain of rhetorical deception. But what I will do, rather than that, is I will return to my voiceover of Michael Mercel's introduction and my reading of it and my elaboration of it, and I'll return to that moment in which I discuss Michael Mercel's framing device, right, that David refers to as rhetorical deception as discursive domain, and then from there we'll come back to David's discussion, rather than what David actually does, which is to return directly to Michael Mercel's speech, right? So we'll do that momentarily, and then we'll return to the discussion. All right. So this is from part one of our discussion, in which I'm narrating over Michael Mercel's discussion of David, what he imagines David Antin is going to perform in this particular piece.
Or parallapses is not the same as being.
And this is my discussion is leading up to a recounting of Michael Mercel's references to the movement of this grand piano onto the stage, and what that represents in terms of another aspect of what we've been talking about, which is the immediate connection to the audience, and he utilizes this.
That things take this form, and
he utilizes this comparison between the physical features of the members that he recognizes in the audience and the features of the grand piano, to explore this idea of the physical space of, there he's pointing to the different directions of the physical space in the performance that inform immediate, right, modes of storytelling and narrating, that might not be apparent to us when these performances become textualized, right, and divorced from their material realities in space and time. So it returns us to this notion that David discusses later. I mean, it doesn't return us to it. It sort of precedes this moment that David discusses later, when he refers to that boy that Aesop, is calling attention to, in the way that Aesop constructs. In the way that Aesop constructs his version, right, of the pseudologoi, and the way that they are in fact not the daughters of Eris, but in fact are, right, the constructs of Dolos, just as so Dolos constructs them in the same way that
in the movement and play,
in the same way that Daedalus, constructs the labyrinth, and the important, metapoetic revelation in that particular moment of Aesop's telling is that he's both talking about the way that he's constructing the story. Oh, my tea just went off. I'm making tea, and I've got to interrupt this. I've got to interrupt this here for just a second, so that that I can put the hot water in my tea. So let's go ahead and turn this off and then do that. And but this moment in Aesop, in which he through this window that he opens up by retelling the story that everyone was familiar with, and everyone would have been aware that this was a domain of rhetorical deception, just like those in the UCSD circles would have been aware that in fact Kathy Acker wasn't personally and in terms of narrative identification familiar with as a student with Herbert Marcuse, but that certainly was aware of the implications of his construction of this model of repressive desublimation. We're done with that. We can return to Michael Mersel.
Sequence of transformations within these boundaries that limit those transformations to certain types of forms, right? It can't be defined that way. It has to be defined more like the way that the Greek stage is defined, by movements this way and that, left and right, strophe and antistrophe, strophe, antistrophe.
So again, right here, I'm recounting Michael Mersel's discussion of
movement, one could say,
of the Parabasis, and both the literal interpretation of Parabasis in growing out of Thalia in Greek comedy, and its aspects that he's hinting at in relationship to this larger stepping out that represents the domain of transgression, right? Parabasisia as the muse of transgression.
Because the difference between deception and the perception of deception is so important in the movement and play back and forth as strophe and antistrophe in this figuration, and in fact that metanarrativity can't exist without this movement back and forth. In fact, implicitly, what David seems to be arguing is that,
and all of this, of course, is my recounting of Michael Mersel's account of both his understanding of the work that David has already performed and produced, both within this series and outside of this series, and of what he imagines will constitute the discussion that is still to follow.
Between confabulation and what we might call the Pinocchio problem, and we'll discuss that perhaps further as well, as we proceed further through the narratives, and that's a good place to begin with a description of Michael Mersel's introduction to this long.
Okay, so I've finally gotten to the point where I'm going to begin discussing Michael Mersel's introduction. I've actually performed a long introduction to the recounting of Michael Mersel's introduction that I'm going to perform. And we've just now, reached that moment. There we go. There's the reference to the grand piano. So I'll be quiet now, and we have no tea to get, so we won't be interrupted, any further at this point. Unless I find it necessary to say something that I neglected to say in my first my first recounting of Michael Mersel's introduction.
Between perception, right? Like the audience in ancient Greece, depending upon whether we know, that Laius, is not there,
and this is how he's drawing,
accidentally or not,
the idea of the mythos logos and the familiarity of the stories to an ancient Greek, right? So like if you are aware of for example, like the disparities between Sophocles' version of Oedipus on the Road to Thebes and Aristophanes' version of Oedipus on the Road to Thebes, you would have a different relationship to those stories than if you were unaware of those stories in those contexts. And that's what he's leading to in the comparison of the features of the grand piano with the characters, those individuals in the audience that he knows, he's familiar with because he has personal knowledge of, right? And so that comparison, right, of the features of the grand piano, which are familiar in a different way, and the features of familiar, that is socially known members of the audience, in the same way that
coming into the telling,
the known members of the audience in Aesop's telling, right, become part of the narrational strategy as well, and
knows the deep background of the story, knows that Laius had been informed later.
Right, and so this is where I'm recounting that familiarity with those stories, and moving toward the comparison with the rhetorical familiar and the modes, right? The modes of rhetorical address that exist in real time space when one is telling a story, as opposed to writing it down on a page or creating it as merely textual representation that in a certain sense universalizes time, but by universalizing time really takes it out of the material modalities that inform its relationship to the arche, right? And so both the social rhetorical acts that are significant in the Aesop and the poet's relationship to arche, like, are effectively removed. I mean, they may be replaced by other material elements, but and certainly, like, they can be reinvented as textual representation in
identities in some sense as audience members, right?
In a work that begins right on the page, but they won't produce they won't produce a same relationship to a moment or a duration or the theatricality that is dramatized in actual space-time that a live performance can, and this becomes important in understanding the difference between storytelling as performance and storytelling as performed as textual representation.
Michael Mercel opens with this comparison of the familiar faces, right? Playing off of that idea of how familiar is the audience with all of this material.
Like how familiar was Aesop with his audience when he was telling his fable and explaining the origin of the pseudologoi, right? Like if he didn't know anything about the members of that audience, he might not have chosen that strategy of retelling, right?
To this idea of what we can refer to as autobiographical memory, and his discussion of that, but also to the way that he identifies the individuals in the audience by calling attention to why these spaces are familiar, and to comparing, right, audience members' faces to the familiar features of a grand piano. So, so with that, I can more or less begin, and what I'll do is I'll narrate, over each section and describe what the figure on stage is discussing and narrating as we go along. So we'll begin with and I'll mute the actual discussions and merely narrate that. All right, so this is the beginning of Michael Mersel's introduction to David Antin, and this piece that David Antin is going to perform, via speaking or talking, that is referred to as Varieties of Deception in the strategic narratology of storytelling, and here he's acknowledging the familiar faces and the audience, and appreciating the familiar faces for being there, and then defining that familiarity as through the comparison of faces with the familiar features of the grand piano. So he recognizes this one's face as more rich and varying in sonority than an ordinary face, and then this one's face is having a wide dynamics from pianissimo to fortissimo, and that one's face, he claims.
So that barking was not in my recounting of Michael Mersel's account of the familiarity of spaces, but it's actually in the diegetic space, from which I'm re-recording my account, and that's Fiverr, expressing
and then this one's face, sound
his desire to communicate with one of the dogs who are barking outside. So just to clarify that didn't belong, that crying dog noise didn't belong to this recounting of Michael Mersel, but to my re-recording of it.
88 white, wood or ivory covered teeth, and this one's face appears to have a retractable cover, and upon this one's face is a presentation of sheet music, and this one's face doesn't have a spring that needs to be reset, he claims, and this one over here has a face that looks like it might come from Astoria, Queens, and just like that story, since we've been talking about Oedipus, just like that story of Oedipus, and there's a moment, and after that decisive moment in which Oedipus kills Laius, that Oedipus is greeted.
And Oedipus kills Laius, both in the Aristophanes version, the smile of the Sphinx, and in Sophocles' version, whatever that might be called, I forget now, but
he got through that.
I think it may be titled after Oedipus' name.
That he speaks, so he can. I need to.
But you can look that up in
beginning so that I can
in Aristotle's Poetics if you want to, because as everyone is aware, Aristotle's Poetics, that is the transcription of his lectures regarding tragedy, and as they're represented in that first volume of the Poetics, is more or less survives, and unlike his discourse on the Muse Dahlia, which is lost, but we can speculate a lot about, and have speculated a lot about. So anyway, And then just to clarify, that crying, that dog noise, if we want to go back, let's just go back, because we can easily follow Michael Mersel's discourse. It's fairly easy to follow, even with all of my interruptions. There, that bark belongs to the diegetic reality of the initial explanation of Michael Mersel's introduction, and doesn't belong to the reality in which I'm speaking right now, like that other interruption and crime. So those two, they're the same dog, but in different moments of narrating, right? And in that sense, they're equally real, but they're different durations in the span of the arche. But the arche belongs to the same domain
of the basis of autobiography,
of space, if not time, but to the same constraints of the space-time continuum.
A specific type of memory either emerges from or contains at least an idea of self.
All right. Well, I think that
and what self might be, and autobiographical knowledge and memory.
We're getting close to where we can return to David's discussion, because this is the segment that David is referring back to
about itself, to itself,
and I seem to be finished recounting Michael Mersel's account of the grand piano, and bringing it into the play of his introduction.
Conditions of confabulation, or whether it's entirely accurate, and one could say whatever, even if one doesn't believe in objectivity, honest.
Let's just say that's enough, and that's the segment that David Antin returns to and recounts. And so let's return to now, or begin recounting the way that David addresses and responds to Michael Mersel's narrative involving the movement of a grand piano into that space, and then his comparison of the features of the grand piano to the features of members of the audience. And the first thing that David talks about is he talks about memories of Astoria, Queens, and which wasn't a neighborhood in which he grew up, but which was a neighborhood that he was certainly familiar with, and for a number of reasons. But by the time that, and I'm stepping out of recounting David Antin's discussion now, but by the time that I lived in Astoria, it was largely a Greek neighborhood, and particularly, if one wanted to be specific, a neighborhood, of a Greek Cypriot, neighborhood, but not entirely. I mean, the neighborhood was still like fantastically and wonderfully diverse, and there was a large Sikh population, as well as a number of Middle Eastern cafes, and a large Islamic population. There were Colombians, and anyway, you get the idea. And so that's the diversity that was represented in Astoria when I was living there, and let's return now, from that digression into my diegetic space, back to the discourse that David Antin is producing here. So, basically, the Astoria that exists in the time that in the space-time that in which David Antin is narrating and recounting and producing, this discourse and discussion, was essentially the same the period of time in which I was living there. So the the Astoria and the Steinway Street that is contemporaneous with David's discourse is essentially the same community and neighborhood that I'm familiar with in my period of living in this neighborhood, and David basically describes it in a similar way. But he begins the discussion of this place and Steinway and its and the reason perhaps that he draws upon these narratives of the Greek muses and doesn't begin somewhere else is because he says this. He says, well Michael Marcel made a passing reference to the topicality of an impending event, which could represent a sort of peripeteia, but that I'm going to engage as an example of a domain, a kind of rhetorical deception or a fiction that opens up into a domain of discourse, and so I want to discuss the possible meanings of this reference, the grand piano. And some of those are going to be personal and come from my own autobiographical experience, and some might exist in the culture more broad way. But he says this to begin with, and he says and this may in some way account for the fact that I turned in this discussion largely to the construction of these various muses as a way of engaging the idea of narrative and its distinctions from collage. If in any reasonable manner whatsoever we can make a distinction between this modality of narrative and this modality of collage, as they exist entirely independent of one another and are not mutually informative in some of the ways that I've been suggesting. He says, but perhaps the reason that I've turned to this figure of muses and the history of muses is because today, and then he basically reiterates what I had already stated, in today, following that period of the 90s in which the community, significantly and perhaps radically, shifted in its, cultural population and communities, right? Communities of cultural and national experience that the Astoria of today, is largely a Greek, Cypriot neighborhood, and perhaps that idea of this topos of Greek experience and what that represents, emerged right from this moment in Michael Marcel's introduction, in which he refers to the movement of a grand piano, and so David wants to explore. He says, well, how does this come into consciousness? How does the relationship to the history of these Greek muses, right, and this place, Astoria, emerge from what seems to be an almost arbitrary, and almost aleatory, right, and from the Latin word for throw of the dice, not for the Greek word for truth, not under the muse aletheia, right, but under the chance dice throw of this term, grand piano. And he says, well, think about it this way. It's hard for anyone, like myself, a child growing up in Brooklyn in the 1940s, not to think of a grand piano, without thinking of the neighborhood of Astoria, and then perhaps it was the pushing of that experience of memory, of Astoria, based upon the connection with the grand piano and Steinway and Sons, right, and the community that was originally established in this neighborhood that we now refer to as Astoria, and back in the mid 1800s, right, as a kind of self-contained community, following Steinway's success on the island of Manhattan. A few years, after he began his business originally in 1853, it's hard not, for a kid like me growing up in Brooklyn, not to associate grand pianos with this neighborhood in Astoria, right? And knowing now, right, that and being familiar with the changes in that neighborhood and what it currently and presently represents in terms of a cultural signification, that perhaps that drew my mind to the idea of Greek culture and what it means to transport a culture into a new domain, a topos, or maybe a series of topoi, a segmentation of topoi across a cluster of islands or a domain of territory that is significantly defined by relationships of cultural power, but insignificantly, marked, as contained, right? Contained cultural durations of and boundaries, right? Of discrete. And singularly, localizable, right? Non-transformative, culture. That is, it's always in the process of transforming, and it's always in the process of exceeding its boundaries, and it's always in the process of territorializing and deterritorializing and reterritorializing and moving from here to here and migrating and doing all of these fantastical things that belong to any experience of cultural migration, which is so much and so profoundly a part of the American experience, right? So what he's getting at in all of this is and reminding us, right, of his own memories from childhood and associations that he makes with the piano and Steinway's is one way, that his focus, right, on the idea of these different domains of poetics and these different genres of art making, maybe one of the reasons why he fell back upon his knowledge of the history of these muses as they're expressed in Greek mythology and in this long tradition of classical culture, which in some sense he belongs to, associating his poetics as he does, with that which is produced, and one of his founding heroes and belonging to the same line of Melite as Socrates does, right? Socrates, not Sophocles. Let's make sure that we're clear about that. And although we've seen that at least in one telling of the history of the Muses, that Sophocles, both Sophocles and Aristophanes also belong to the line of Melite, that is thought, occasion, and all of that. But so he briefly narrates, the history of the relationship to this space, Astoria, and the history of the founding of this particular industry, right, and the community that grows out of it, and what it's become, and its relationship to his choice of the Greek muses, and then he returns to this idea of this space that might easily have had the grand piano not been introduced into the discussion, he might have chosen another space, but even if he chose, the topos, the location of Astoria, the scaffolding, through which he explored these ideas of poetry and poetics and narrative and narratology, might have been different, based upon whatever associations that Memne, made, or whoever it was, that represented memory in a different constellation of ideas, in relationship to a different object, a different kind of medallion, if you like, right, and its relationship to a different space. So he narrates the space of Astoria itself, historically as it belonged to the period of colonialization and the period, prior to colonialization. But he begins by narrating, his memories of it as a child, and he starts with its connection with Steinway. So he discusses the fact that in the mid-19th century, there were a large, number of German and Irish immigrants in this area, and one of those, German immigrants happened to be Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg. And Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg, later known as Henry E. Steinway when he anglicized his name, but that wasn't, until, quite a bit later. David mentions that he began this industry, this factory, and the production of grand pianos on the island of Manhattan in 1853, right? And narrates this history. So in 1853, Henry E. Steinway, then known as Heinrich Engelhard, Steinweg, begins this industry. And it wasn't until, David points out, it wasn't until 1864 that, and following the anglicization of may have been somewhat later. So in 1864, the family anglicizes this name from Steinweg to Steinway, and then perhaps a few years later, David recounts, probably sometime between 1870 and 1880, now William Steinway, right, born Wilhelm Steinweg. This is the son of Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg, right? Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg began the grand piano business in Manhattan in 1853, but it wasn't until the 1870s, perhaps sometime in the 1870s, that his son Wilhelm Steinweg, but now William Steinway, right, moves a large part of the industry to what will, eventually become the Astoria neighborhood of Queens. And at that time, it wasn't, but what it was it was a professional community largely attached from the not entirely independent of the economy of Manhattan, but in large way, in large measure, economically, self-sustaining community, and not in the manner of utopian transcendentalism or some of these spiritual and religious communities that were established, as alternatives, right? Sub communities, or in many ways, like in the 60s, right? Like the communities that were established, apart from, or like the idea of dropping out of the national, the national and state, structure of existence, and falling into a kind of independence, or whether the model for that independence was based on a mode of socialism as organization, a mode of religious, community organization, or a combination, of the two, or beyond any combination of the two, whether it was based on Fourier or any other any other model of community idealism. David points out, this clearly this clearly was not what the company town Steinway Village was about, right? It didn't have any pretensions of being like this independently organized, ideologically, pure or socially, utopian, project, like some of these other ideas of independent communities, whether they belong to American Transcendentalism or Neo-American Transcendentalism, as some communities and self-organizing, groups in the '60s and perhaps, somewhat prior to the '60s did. But rather, like met the necessity of and challenge of sustaining a community of industrial workers, right, in a time and situation in which travel, right, to the proximity of those goods and resources that belong to the island of Manhattan, would have been somewhat, difficult. So it was clearly, a project, maintained under the aegis and ideological, what would one say, provisionalism? That's not the right word. Ideological grace. Let's just say grace. Grace of capitalism by the son of Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg, now known as William Steinway, right? All right, so he establishes this professional community, David narrates, in as a company town, and calls it Steinway Village, and that's the location of Steinway Village is now, the same location that we know of as Astoria in Queens, and Steinway Street in Astoria in Queens, continues to provide the location for this manufacturer, which continues, into the present, and continues to manufacture these grand pianos, and so along with the industry of the manufacturing of these grand pianos, Steinway Village was also, built as this independent, somewhat economically independent, but not entirely, as we've discussed, and non-transcendental, non-utopian model of independence, and it included, along with the piano factory, it had its own foundry, sawmill, houses for employees. It had kindergarten for the students, a lending library, post office, volunteer, fire department, parks, etc., etc., etc. And then Steinway Village, later became part of Long Island City, and part of the village, and the success of that model, grew into the community of Astoria, as well as Long Island City, and somewhat influenced peripheral neighborhoods in the area of Queens as well, right? And so David, talks about all of this, and then and he mentions in passing that in 1920, the first movie studio opened in Astoria, and it's referred to sometimes as Astoria Kaufman Studios. Later became probably more famously known as Paramount Studios, and he narrates the changes and transformations of the neighborhood, and the fact that that in the aftermath of World War II, there was a new wave of immigration from Italy and Greece, and that, certainly by the early and mid 90s, the Greeks accounted for approximately half of the population of Astoria. This place that, in his memory and experience, growing out of his relationship to the immediate and proximal environment in which he grew up in the 1940s, it's very difficult for him not to think of grand pianos without thinking of Steinway and Astoria, right? All right, so he's thinking about this perhaps and speculating on his selection of an account and history of the Muses, and notes the changes in the demographics in the 90s, and then also notes that as those demographics continue to change, there also has emerged a significant Arab population, and there is even on Steinway Street, an area, there is an area on Steinway Street, unofficially, known and but recognized, unofficially known as Little Egypt, right? And you can go there and you can frequent the cafes and drink, wonderful, mint teas and eat, wonderful Middle Eastern foods and if you speak Arabic, which I don't, you can, unfortunately, there was a time in which, I wanted very much to learn Arabic, as well as Greek, but, unfortunately, the limits of my own, cognitive embodiment didn't allow, that possibility, and well, at least it didn't allow that possibility in under the conditions of which one struggles also to survive and acquire resources and make a living. So all of these activities take time. This is, if it's not clear, this is me breaking out of David's discussion. David is very comfortable in both Greek and Arabic and most Eastern European languages, as well as most Central European languages, and I believe many Native American languages as well, although I may be mistaken about that. But I think that I'm not sure which Asian branches of language that David's familiar with, but I'm fairly certain there must be many of those as well. In any case, then following that and saying so it's possible, right? It's possible that that I might have chosen a different set, of a different history, right? A different theoretical history, or a different background, or a different set of ideas, under which to narrate all of these domains of narrative and poetics, and I might have chosen them from some domain of Islamic and Arabic thought, rather than Greek. And he says, but perhaps the reason that I didn't do that is simply because I'm more familiar, with the dynamics of Melite and her sisters than I am with these ways of thinking about of narrative and poetics, from within the tradition of Islam, and then he says, or I might have begun because also in the 90s, there was a large, Eastern European and South American change in demographics, through the immigration of South American and Eastern European communities into the same area. I could have chosen a history, right? That outside of the history of the Muses,
from one of those domains as well. And he basically, recounts the same changes in the demographics, or the I didn't really account the history of the changes of the demographics the way that he does. But I had mentioned the diversity, right? I had mentioned it as if it were this stable moment in space-time in which I occupied Astoria. But David actually talks about the history. So he talks about the history, and he begins there, but he says, but, of course, he says, just like, the rest of the places in our world, that Astoria existed, but under the terms of a different set of cultural symbolic significance and names, right? Prior to the creation of Steinway Street and Steinway Village. But I never would have gotten there, he says, if I hadn't tied the grand pianos. He said, I never would have gotten there if I hadn't tied Michael Mersel's reference to the grand piano to this particular place. But what if, he says, but what if there had been a different reference? What if there had been some other reference that tied me to the same place? And then he raises his arm, he raises his hands up like this, like imagining like that we could be transported, by a different figure, by a different mode. And remember that he still hasn't really opened up the discussion of how moving this grand piano, right, in physical space is going to represent a kind of opening of a discursive field, right? He hasn't talked about the way that it is going to constitute a discursive domain that relates to narrative and collage and specifically, autobiography and the frames of autobiography and how they relate to deception yet. But he says, I'll get back to that. But first, I want to, raise the possibility that maybe Michael introduced some other object, and some other object, pointed to the same place, the same topos, but not within the same constitution of time. That it didn't depend upon this moment, right? It didn't depend upon this moment and this history in which in which I know Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg, changed his name to Henry E. Steinway, and his son William Steinway, moved this piano, this grand piano manufacturing industry, to the specific location. But it depended on something else. It depended on some object that also, still, like, let's just say that I'm still that young man, growing up in Brooklyn in the 1940s. And something that he said, maybe it was something I remembered from a discussion of an archaeological artifact or something else. But it brought me, in the same way to the island, Long Island, it brought me to a memory of Long Island, and maybe it brought me to a memory of something that I learned in history when I was growing up in the 1940s in Brooklyn, and I remember from history class, or maybe it was later, at some other moment in time, and I recalled, the history of all these original inhabitants of the island that we call, Long Island. And I remembered, learning that there were, 13, different tribes, who occupied this island, and it brought me back to the memory of these histories, that this place, way before that Steinway ever got there and transformed, this place into Steinway Village, that later became Long Island City, and the place that we know today as Astoria, that maybe we may associate with, in a certain way, Greek culture or Little Egypt or something else. But long before this, there were these histories of these people, these tribes, and there were 13 of them. And I remember that one of them was known as the Canarsie. And the Canarsie, they occupied this territory on the western end of the island, included, a lot of where I grew up in Brooklyn, right, and extended eastward, to into the town that was, once referred to as Jamaica, and I remembered, stories, about the Canarsie and how they, because they were so close to the native people that lived on the island of Manhattan, it was speculated that there was a lot of trade that passed through, right? In the same way that there must have been a lot of trade between Steinway Village and the industry, that was there before Steinway Village on the island of on Manhattan, right? From which this place, this village, emerged, right, and became, somewhat independent, but not entirely, right? So not entirely independent, in the same way that the Canarsie couldn't have been entirely independent from the natives that sustained themselves on the island of Manhattan. And I remembered about the Rockaways. I remembered about the rock. Again, this is David's voice. The I that I'm producing here is David's voice and remembering. So I remember the Rockaways and how these people, how that's the name, Rockville Center is related, is connected etymologically to the same name that we have for the Rockaway tribe, right? And Rockville Center is within, the territory that the Rockaways occupied, and this tribe was scattered throughout the southern part of the town of Hempstead, and over a large, extended territory, from Rockville Center basically to West Rockaway Beach, and perhaps even beyond that, perhaps north to Long Island Sound as well. And then David discusses the Merricks. He talks about the fact that the Merrick communities were, that they thrived along the southern part of Long Island, from near Rockville Center, right, to the western line of Oyster Bay, and probably north as well, to a line running east and west through the middle of the island, and it's speculated, he remembers this, it's like, I remember this. Originally, it was speculated that they may have lived on the extreme, western end of Long Island, but they were forced to move. They were forced to move into new territory, controlled, largely by the Massapequas. All right, and then he talks a little bit about that history, and then he moves on to the Massapequas, and talks about their boundaries that extended along the southern shore from Seaford to Islip, and in the north to an arbitrary line somewhere running east and west through the center of the island. And he talks about the history of battles that were fought there with European settlers near the middle of the 17th century, and a lot of that knowledge is lost to me now, and I can't remember exactly what it is that he narrates. And David's memory is extraordinary, and the idea, that he can move, across, these planes and spaces of time, so fluidly, and so so in a certain sense artlessly, without notes and without rehearsal is somewhat remarkable. But he talks about, all of the battles and the skirmishes between the European settlers and the Massapequas, before moving on to the Metapoetics, and then he discusses the Metapoetics along the North Shore and the territory that extended all the way from Flushing Bay on the west to the river. What was that river called? David doesn't stumble over it. He just remembers. Is that river at Smithtown? What's that river at Smithtown called? Oh, Nissequogue. Nissequogue. It's named again after a Native American tribe, right? The Nissequogue River at Smithtown, and then he discusses. I can't remember whether it's here in this particular moment after he discusses the Metapoetics, but he discusses because I've remembered the name of the river now at Smithtown. I'll just jump to the Nissequogues, and he discusses whether that's a prolepsis or an analepsis. Now I'm not entirely sure, but anyway, you can see the way that my mind has jumped. So he discusses the Nissequogues, Nissequogues, and their territory, adjoined by the Metapoetics on the west, and then the way that territory extended eastward from the Nissequogue, river all the way to Stony Brook and south to the center of the island. And I probably remember that, somewhat from having, spent some time at University of, or Stony Brook University, SUNY Stony Brook, State University of New York at Stony Brook, and perhaps picking it up from David Antin's recounting of this history as well. To be fair to him, talks about the Setaukets and their territory from Stony Brook to Wading River, and I think his discussion of the Setaukets is somewhat brief, as well as his discussion of the Korchogs, who controlled the land to the east of the Setaukets, and whose territory was bounded on the west by the line extending from Wading River to the center of the island and east along the north fluke to the island of Orient Point, right? And he talks about the Secatogs and the territory of the Secatogs, which was, if I'm remembering correctly, the territory of the Secatogs was to the east of the territory occupied by the let's see, was to the east of the territory occupied by, can I remember? Oh, to the east of the territory occupied by the Massapequas, and it extended along the south shore from Islip to Patchogue, and then north to the center of the island. And they occupied a lot of the village sites along the tidal creeks that flow into the Great South Bay. He talks about the Unkachogs, and I'm not sure I entirely remember what their territory was. He does mention that there's some confusion about the Unkachogs' name and a confusion about that, but he mentions that they're, I think if I remember correctly, and I'm not sure if he's correct or not, but I think I remember him narrating. I don't know this on my own, but I think I remember him narrating that their territory extended along the south shore from Patchogue and as far east as West Hampton, and perhaps to Canoe Place. The Shinnecocks, then I think it's the Shinnecocks he turns to next, and reminds us that they were the most famous and perhaps the most dominant among the chieftaincies on the island, and that their territory included the south fluke of Long Island from West Hampton to Canoe Place, all the way to East Hampton, and it also took over several necks of the land, at least at one point, along the south shore of the Peconic Bay. And then I can't remember what order that he discusses them in, but he discusses, these last two of the 13, Montaukett, who were recognized as the most powerful group of the eastern end of Long Island, and probably throughout, that, at least at one point in history, the island as it narrows to Montauk Point. And the Montaukett chieftaincy controlled the land, from the southern fluke, that is from East Hampton through the entire eastern tip of the island. And they also occupied Gardiner's Island, and I can't remember what else he says about them. And then he mentions the Manhassets, right? That name should sound familiar. The Manhassets, and specifies that this was another large chieftaincy, particularly important in the early period, well before European colonization, and the fact that they occupied these islands, Shelter Island, Hog Island, Ram Island, between the North and South Flukes. And they were also compelled, he says, to pay tribute, right, to the peoples of the mainland, even before European colonization, so that they were already colonized as a group, as a tribal group among the 13 known tribes of Native Americans that are part of our knowledge of the history of this place. And so he says that any one of them, because presumably, like each one of these tribes, even if they shared in part, right, even if they shared cultural heritage and history in a certain way, but each tribe had a different way of telling a mythologos, perhaps, or maybe their mythoi, were considerably different among the 13 tribes. And so if something had inspired me, he says, other than a grand piano, to consider this place and to think about this place, but it belonged to this historical period. Maybe it was some cultural artifact, that preceded, the idea of a grand piano by far. Maybe it was a rattle, or maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a shell. Maybe it was wampum. Maybe it was something else. Maybe Michael Mercel made reference to wampum or something else, or whatever it might have been. And in doing so, or a buckskin or something, some cultural artifact that belonged to this period, and maybe I was inspired, to take figurations from Montaukett or the Manhassets or the Shinnecock or the Unkachogs, or maybe I was inspired to imagine, that each of these, somewhat discrete, but economically and culturally interacting, right? Sociocultural communities, right? Like they embodied a different aspect and a different way of aestheticizing and making materials, and I could have utilized that as the means in to talk about all these different relationships between narrating and what a story might be, and what the difference between story and narrative might be, and what the external frames, right? What the external frames of autobiography mean to the creation of a fictive domain. And I could have done that instead of talking about the history of the muses, he says. But the figure that was drawn in by Michael Mercel, was drawn as a figure of a grand piano, and there may have been, more reason to talk about grand pianos than Michael, was letting on, and there may have been, he says there may have been other significances than to point to Steinway Street and Steinway Village, and there may have been other roads, for me to take into the relationship between autobiography, right? Me as a kid in the 1940s in Brooklyn, thinking about these Steinway pianos in Astoria, right? And my memories of Astoria, and my memories of this place, and these Native American people who lived there before the European colonizers came, before the Dutch and English settlers, the Dutch and East India Company's activities and the first European settlers, in the area that eventually became Long Island, and Astoria were the Dutch, right? And probably, the first Dutch explorer that he may or may not have seen Astoria, or this area that wasn't Astoria yet, that would perhaps become Astoria. This guy Adrian Block, right? Adrian Block. By the mid 17th century, the English had already arrived, buying up all of the land in Queens and pushing out the natives, pushing out the Manhassets, pushing out the Montaukets, pushing out the Shinnecocks, pushing out the Unichogs, pushing out the Sectagogs, pushing out the Korchogs, pushing out the Nissaquoqui, how do you say, Nissaquoqui, pushing out the Matinacocks, pushing out the Massapequas, pushing out the Merricks, pushing out the Rockaways, pushing out the Carnacy, right? And one of those guys, that was doing all of that colonial work, right? David's recalling, was this Englishman by the name of William Hallett, right? And then and that was Astoria's original name, right? It was named after this guy William Hallett, right? That territorialized these places and took it and stole it, right? Basically stole it. He didn't create an industry like Steinway Village, but he's basically a thief, and he stole this land, and he moved everybody that was originally there off, and claimed they didn't have a culture, right? And it wasn't Greek culture that he brought to this place. It was whatever this British culture was at the time, which wasn't much of a culture at all. He says, and he laughs. This isn't the moment. Obviously, I've lost track of the sync of where we are in retelling, because when David Antin narrates this part, he's laughing. So let's find a moment where see if we can find a moment where he's smiling and laughing. Maybe here. Maybe this is it. No. So he's like, this could be it. No, he's discussing. Let's see. He's discussing how these British people pushed everybody off and claimed they didn't have a culture. I don't have a culture. Maybe this is it. Yeah, there you go. And okay, that's where they were smiling. So now we're back in sync with where he's narrating the discussion of Hallett's Cove. This original name, not original at all, right? But this original English colonial name for Astoria, Hallett's Cove, and he talks, about the history of, during the Revolutionary War. Following in 1776, the British won the Battle of Long Island. They marched all the way from Brooklyn, to Queens, and they occupied this area for several years that we now know as Astoria. So even after the American Revolution, Astoria was occupied, by the British, not after the American Revolution per se, but after the beginning of the American Revolution, this period was occupied by the British, and who didn't leave until the final and concluding moments of the end of the Revolutionary War, right? So that here, history of occupation, might have lent itself. If some cultural object, like a musket, like if Michael Marcel had mentioned a musket, right, or whatever else it was that the British, the redcoats, right, used, in the Revolutionary War, perhaps David says my memory would have turned, not toward the Greeks and the Muses. But perhaps, he says, as a young kid, growing up in the 1940s in Brooklyn, and knowing the history of this place, and reminded and inspired by this artifact, whatever it was, a musket that served the function of a mandolin, like a mandolin in Proust, but it was a musket. And instead of taking me to Steinway, Street, and thinking about the present, and thinking about the way that the demographics have changed, and being reminded of the Muses because of the Greeks, and the Cypriots, and all like that terrific Greek food that you can get in Astoria. Maybe instead of all of that, I was reminded of the British, and then I would have chosen a different way of thinking about poetry. I would have been turned instead, to William Shakespeare. Maybe William Shakespeare, or maybe Milton, or maybe some of the British writers around the time of the Revolutionary War. Maybe I would have turned to William Blake, and I would have talked about, instead of talking about the Greek muses, I would have talked about William Blake. Could be. I mean, he says it's not necessarily the case that would have happened, but it's possible to imagine, right? It's possible to imagine. And I could have talked about Thomas Paine, and I could have talked about William Blake. I could have talked about the poetics of the Age of Enlightenment, and how the poetics of someone like William Blake in the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, curiously turned into, right? It turned into a kind of like a precursor to Romanticism, and how Romanticism, turned into a precursor for modernism, and how modernism, turned into a precursor for what we continue to do in many ways today, and how sometimes what we recognize as these discrete segments, an articulation of perspectives in time, like the idea of modernism and its relationship to the avant-garde. Well, it depends on this entire history of having a relationship to the development of Romanticism, and growing out, maybe in substantial ways that we haven't considered before, of this idea of the Age of Reason and Enlightenment, right? And sometimes we want to set these up as oppositional, but in many ways, that it's like these movements and changes in demographics, right? That there are reasons that inspire the flux and flow of these changes, and like if you're taking account of the movement of water in a river, like say it's the Hudson River, or say it's the East River, you don't want to just identify all these little micro phenomena that are separate from themselves, but you take into account the season and the flow and the dynamics of change, and whether there's ice, and whether there's ice on the East River, and how far that that ice extends, and what the and how the temperature changes the movement of the current, and whether you can cross it or not, and if that creates obstacles to the flow of trade and economics that to inspire you to have a relationship with the native inhabitants of Manhattan, if you're the Canarsie or the Rockaway or the Merricks or the Massapequas, or if you're creating a little independent community because you want to build these pianos on the island now known as Long Island, then then your understanding of how easy it is, to navigate and negotiate this movement across the water becomes important in how you produce your culture and how you survive, right? So he talks about all of that before he returns back to other ways of thinking about the grand piano and the movement of the grand piano, and we'll talk about that, and we'll specifically talk about the way that David Antin draws this image of the moving of a grand piano into his discussion, and connects it back to this idea of narrative and autobiography and the frames and discursive domains, right, that are created by examples of rhetorical deception. We'll talk about the way that he draws it into the language poets and this period, between 1976, I think it is, and 1979, in which, in this little San Francisco coffee house, called, I believe, unless I'm failing to remember what David narrates in this section, that was called the Grand Piano, and he talks about this period, and this period of collage, and this period of expanded theoretical concern around the idea of parataxis as a way of evading, the commodity fetishization as it was seen of narrative, but the way that this moment and the theorization of this way out, right? Like for Kathy has to come to terms with Herbert Marcuse and his idea of repressive desublimation, right? In order to proceed on her course to Thebes, which is a course of transgression, right? Under the aegis of the muse Parabasisia, if that's indeed the way that you pronounce the name of that muse, Parabasis, right? And this stepping out, this transgressive, this muse of transgression. And in order to do this, she has to take on, she has to take on as her father figure, or she has to take on in some way, and she chooses to take him on as her father figure and teacher in this rhetorically deceptive manner that I've defined, David says, as an example of discursive domain, right? Deception as discursive domain, and he says that the language poets in this moment in this coffee house, right? In this coffee house called the Grand Piano, wish to take on narrative in the same manner that some years later, but not really too many, right? Not really too many years later that and roughly within the same period that Kathy Acker is challenging this notion of repressive desublimation in the figure of Herbert Marcuse. So David says, so let's say that rather than creating a narrative, that's set on the road to Thebes, like that we're talking about engaging as a metaphor of rhetorical deception, the act of moving a grand piano into a small space, right? Okay, that was great. We're right on target, because you can see that that the hand gestures are right. Let's say, he says. Let's go back so we can see those hand gestures in relationship. Oh, there it goes. So let's say that rather than placing this discursive domain, right, on the road to Thebes as an encounter with between Laius and Oedipus and the Sphinx, because it's really a three-way encounter in a certain sense. Sometimes we think of it just as Oedipus and Laius, but the Sphinx is there too. He has to deal with that, and that's what makes it somewhat interesting. So instead of that construct, instead of that domain, right? Instead of that representational domain, let's say we're moving a piano. It's a grand piano. We're moving a grand piano, and the movement of this grand piano has to do with collage, and it has to do with external frames of autobiographical identification. And the construction of an illusion, a coherence. And let's say that it takes more than one person, to move this grand piano. So what kind of autobiography are we talking about? He says, well, it's got to be a collective autobiography if it takes more than one person, right? And he says, and then he does something really interesting where he performs a kind of space-time travel move that he says, well, we know in Michael Mersel's reference, and because we're in the year, he says, we're in the year right now, we're in the year 2006, and that's why I was inspired to talk about the Greek culture, because of the Greek neighborhood of Steinway. He says, we're in the year 2006, and that motivated the movement towards the Greeks. He says, but we know that because the language poets were talking about this in the space called the Grand Piano, between 1976 and 1979. Right, that we're located now in that period. But what we don't know yet is that in just a few years, within a period of about 4 years, these same language poets, and how he knows this is really fascinating, right? And it bears upon perhaps the thaumaturgoi and some other ways of stepping beyond the boundaries of one domain of ontological, stable reality construct into another fictionalized imaginary that belongs to a past or a future. But he says, but in just a few years, the same group of language poets that were performing in this coffee shop called the Grand Piano are going to create. They're going to create a collective account, a collective autobiographical account of the memory, from the year 2010 of this period of time between 1976 and 1979. And then he says, well, and the way that we know this is because, well, we have to go back to one of our muses. And in this case, he says, we haven't talked about Jules Verne, and we haven't talked about and we haven't talked about H.G. Wells, but we have talked about Alfred Jarry. And he says, and we have talked indirectly about a contract in phi through theta in a certain sense, because we know that they will be. He corrects himself there. He says they will be. We know that they will be recounting, right? In some distant moment in the future, he says, we know that a contract in phi through theta, utilizing space, time, travel, communication, coordinate systems, will be recounting what I am, narrating and discoursing about, here, and we have talked about Alfred Jarry, and we've talked about illusion, right, and we haven't specifically talked about Alfred Jarry in relationship to the construct of a time machine, but we can imagine that it's possible, and that we can imagine that it's possible and again, one of these ways of stepping out that can join, perhaps the thaumaturgia, the muses of thaumaturgia, with some of these muses of illusion. Whether they're muses of illusion that belong to the parentage of, pseudologia that belong to the parentage of Eros, or belong to the craft of Dolos, or even Ether or Gaia, or whether, as I proposed, that there were some pseudologoi who are the daughters of Paizo, of play. We don't know. But there's certainly something playful, he says, about space-time travel. And we know, and he says we do know, that or we can imagine, if we don't know, we can certainly imagine that in a period of about 4 years, right, these same language poets, who met together and produced this discourse on collage, and the way that narrative is no longer possible, right, will come together again and produce a form of narrative that will be represented as a collective autobiography, which is paradoxical, right? Paradoxical, and it's paradoxical in the same way that space-time travel is in some ways paradoxical, and he says so. Michael, in his is creating this discursive domain in which we can bring together, the theories that belong, right, to this idea of narrative itself and story as commodity fetish, and the limitations, of some of these conceptions, as he says, as a discursive domain, in the same way that the encounter with Marcuse on the road to Thebes is a discursive domain created by rhetorical deception, and he says, and the rhetorical deception is that there is no grand piano, that there isn't going to be a change of scenery, that no one's moving a grand piano, but it's a figure. It's a figure to talk about this, and it's a figure to talk about what will happen in the year 2010, and then perhaps it's also a figure to talk about the return to these ideas in the future, like either in the future 10 years after that, in 2022. And then he brings, his discussion returns to Trump, and how, we've already talked about the distinction between Trump's forms of deception and their malicious and malevolent, pragmatics as practice, right, and as political stratagem, compared to the beneficial and pedagogical and caring, manners of deception that mother that we talked about, utilizes in telling her children's stories. He returns to that idea, and he says, so perhaps in the year 2020, or perhaps in the year 2022, sometime in the year 2022, then we'll return to that idea of the grand piano again, and bring together, the idea of some of these frames of autobiography and how they relate to the construct of individuality in the I, but how, through the expanse of a deeper understanding of a grammar that belongs to the inner relationships between some of these muses. This muse as arche, this muse as arrangement, this muse as a construct of illusion, right? The construction of illusion. This muse, as thaumaturgical, reorganization of space and time. How? Like through that, the complexities, right? The complexities, and here's like waving his arms to talk about the complexities, not just something in a single box, but the complexities of these issues involving the connections between collage and narrative and autobiography, can be returned to, and can be returned to without having to return to this constrained and sort of idea of self and I, the I that represents the first person pronoun, that belongs to this the singularity of this identity as it constructs it, in this romantic way, sort of constructs itself, as the master of its own universe, but rather, like by redeploying the figurations, of these elements, and including, among them, different varieties and modes of rhetorical deception that we can come to a more complex understanding. So he says, what I'll do, and then we have to end here, but further discuss the grand piano in connection to perhaps what we could conceive of as that collage, that moment of the rhetorical domain, right, that opens up into this theory that is not a theory of rhetorical is not a theory of repressive sublimation, but belongs to a kind of Marxist, a kind of Marxist conceptualization of commodity fetish and as of literary form and as mode, right? As mode, even more than form or genre, storytelling and narrative is a mode of coherence and synthesis that belongs to a way of communication, right? And if it's true that it's a commodity fetish, then and merely a commodity fetish, right? Then the critique will stand, just like Herbert Marcuse's conception of repressive desublimation might stand. But there may be figures, he says, even amongst those original formulators and contemplators, right, of this idea of narrative as a commodity fetish and passive making of meaning as opposed to active making of meaning, that reinvestigate this term and that become like from that maybe shift, right, maybe shift ground from maybe there was a part of Herbert Marcuse that wanted to be Kathy Acker. Who knows, right? And he says, but we'll explore this idea. We'll explore this idea as it's represented in these various moments of the grand piano. And then so those moments, are, that period from 1976 to 1979, and then perhaps that period of period from 2010. He says, I believe that it will be to 2020 or perhaps 2022. He says, I'm not sure on that one. And then he references Cassandra, briefly, and he says, but we've run out of time, and he doesn't know. Actually, that's not true. He says that he needs to take a little break because his throat is getting dry, and he knows there's tea available in the next room. From our perspective, though, in this diegetic space, we definitely have run out of time, and we'll need to return to the grand piano as discursive domain of rhetorical deception in a piece that follows. So we'll conclude with that promise, and that and that anticipation here.